Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, I wish to talk about what I call the hegemony of art, and those of you who have studied Marxism as much as I did, when I thought that it isn't a pile of rubbish as I do now, might recognize this word hegemony, which is frequently used by, for example, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. But although he was obviously talking about different things, he talked about hegemony of culture, meaning that, you know, the ruling class kind of establishes this hegemony over the society and dictates its own values, etc., etc. Well, to a degree, I would be talking about the same thing, but in a completely different context, not talking about classes, obviously. And I should warn you that our consideration here would be quite abstract and but at the same time quite practical. So I hope that you would be able to navigate through those things that I would be talking about here, okay? So the basic idea is really simple in this video. I would claim that there are three stages of evolution of society, if you like. Even though that's a very simplified scheme, but this is exactly what I'm going to be talking about in this video. So the first stage of evolution of society, so to speak, in this context, I repeat, is the hegemony of religion. And we all know all these stories. Of course, it's sort of a modern interpretation of what happened in the past. But still, we currently consider that in the past, like before the scientific revolution, let's say the start of the 16th or 17th century, or before the 16th century in the first place, the world was dominated, what we call the civilized world, meaning Europe, basically, was dominated by religion, etc., etc. So religious patriarchs had all the power, etc. They could basically do anything they wanted. They had all the wealth, blah, blah, blah. So there was this hegemony of religion, right? This was the first stage. Then, after the scientific revolution, after the 17th century, let's say, quickly, it was quickly established, the hegemony of science was quickly established. Well, quickly in relative terms, right? At least in 2 centuries, it was more or less established already. So we have hegemony of religion, then hegemony of science. Now, hegemony of science was also contemporary to the construction of national states, about which I've talked about in my video about stories of history, for example, etc., etc. So now, since the hegemony of science, we have like scientists as the main priests of the age, so to speak. So now it's the scientific authorities who are like deciding what to do, what not to do, etc. They're basically at the helm of the whole development of society. Again, since, well, roughly the beginning of 19th century at least, it was already kind of solidly established, right? And even more so in the 20th century, obviously. But this is the second stage. So hegemony of religion, hegemony of science. And I'm going to be talking about this third stage, this hypothetical stage, which I would call hegemony of art. And this is what this video is about. So, and by art, I mean in general, in the most general sense possible, like creativity, all that kind of stuff, you know. But I just like the word art. I think it has, you know, in Planescape Torment, RPG, video game, the word art from a capital letter means magic, basically. So I'm not going to be talking about magic, but I just kind of like this, you know, this mood when you call magic art, like from a capital letter. But anyway, so the first thing we should note here is that these first two hegemonies were similar, or are similar in certain respect, because both the hegemony of religion and hegemony of science are hierarchical systems. So you have clearly defined hierarchy, like who decides, who has the final word, roughly speaking, right? So in religious stage, we had, again, religious patriarchs, whoever they are, like the Pope or whatever, as the main authority, so to speak. In scientific world, in scientific hegemony of science, we have, like, I don't know, Nobel Prize Committee or whatever. We have probably, like, roughly speaking, clearly defined scientific hierarchies, right? The one who has more scientific awards or whatever power, academic power, they have the final word. So these two are hierarchical systems, right? Whereas I would say that now, at the current day and age, hierarchies are crumbling, and it's really easy to see. I mean, many people talk about this, and there are many factors, obviously, leading to that. In particular, the mass education. Like, people right now are much more literate and smarter in general than the people in the previous ages. Like, the literacy jumped in the last century, like, from maybe, I don't know, 10% in the world, I mean, to like maybe 85 or maybe even more percent. So people are much smarter right now. They have the ability to speak out, so to speak, right? Then we have the advent of nihilism, again, the thing that Nietzsche talked about in his book, for example, Will to Power. Well, that's a separate story about this book. Maybe someday I'll talk about it. But anyway, the whole book basically is devoted to nihilism and how it's going to impact the history of the 20th century. The book is from 1880s, and it describes almost like letter by letter what's going to happen in the 20th century, and it's pretty cool in this respect. But it talks about the advent of nihilism and the destruction of traditional values, etc., and it's very accurate in this respect, right? So traditional values, including like the crumbling of these hierarchies, right? So this is another factor, this sort of cultural one. Then we have new means of communication. I mean, speaking about internet, mass media, etc., etc. So it facilitates both social contacts and also the economic contacts. So these hierarchical structures are no longer needed in a certain sense, right? You can just directly communicate to whoever you want to communicate with, etc., etc. So there are many factors destroying the hierarchies today. But so these two, the religious stage, so to speak, the hegemony of religion, and the hegemony of science, the second stage, were both hierarchical. And probably still are hierarchical. But this third stage that I'm going to be talking about, this hypothetical hegemony of art, is more network oriented. It's more horizontal, right? If hierarchies are vertical, then this one is horizontal in certain sense. So you're talking to peers, so to speak, not to superiors, or how do you say it? Superiors, I don't know. So, and in this context, I believe, in this hypothetical third stage of hegemony of art, this is basically the view of the world with like genuine freedom. Like, what I'm talking about is the possibility, these new possibilities, technical, social, economic, blah, 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 they allow a genuine sort of self-creation, in a sense, like construction of your own perspective, like this complicated game of values, you know, like creation of your own values even. Like again, Nietzsche talked about this a lot, like Thus Spake Zarathustra is the book about values, essentially, like abandoning the values that were imposed upon you and like creating your own values, something to that effect. And it's also a book about loneliness, as I've talked about previously. But anyway, this worldview, this new hypothetical, well, I would actually argue that it's already emerging, like it's already a matter of modern day, so to speak. But anyway, not everyone still recognizes it, so this is one of the purposes of this video, to kind of try to let it speak, so to speak. Again, stupid tautology. So this continuous dance and rhetorical battle of different interpretations, of different systems of values on equal terms, you know, almost like there's a boxing ring or something where they collide. Even though it's not a boxing ring where only two collide, it's actually like a mass fight with many systems of values, roughly equal in their power in the first place. So it's not some elite boxers, two of them only, right, or something to that effect, but it's many of them simultaneously. So yeah, so it's a rhetorical battle. It's a battle of values, of interpretations and possibilities and all of that, because now individuals have much more power than previously, so they can directly clash their interests, their values, etc. So this allows, I believe, the advent of true politics, which is the direct projection of our interests and values, like again, due to these increased possibilities of modern society. And another good analogy I would like to bring forth is the city. Like, you probably heard that in the recent, I'm not sure when it happened, maybe like 20 years ago, but very recently. So the population of cities actually became larger than the population of rural areas, right? So now more than 50% of people live in cities. I'm not sure what is the percent now, maybe 60 already, but I don't know. So this process of urbanization is another factor contributing to this process, to this transition, to this hypothetical hegemony of art, as I call it, hopefully at least, because I like it, to be honest. So, and what's the difference between a city and the, let's say, rural type of behavior and worldview? So a city is not a piece of land, you know. City, strictly speaking, doesn't need a lot of land. Whereas rural areas is all about land, right? So these, you know, large countries, as we call them right now, are all about territory. Like, it's almost the only thing that defines a nation, a state, is its territory, right? It's the like conditio sine qua non, as Latin people said, like condition without which the state is impossible, right? It's the land. So, but it's this old rural thinking in certain sense. Like, we own this land because land was very important, like in medieval times, etc. Because, well, this was the primary resource, right? But the city is a completely different set of values. A city is some self-governing place set up for dialogue, and it's a very small place in certain sense, right? Where, again, different values, different peoples with different views, different religions, different scientific opinions, they clash directly. Like, maybe it's your neighbor that has completely different views, but you still try to establish some sort of dialogue, right? Versus, you know, the clash of states, which is like a frontal war, you know, something like that. Well, that's what usually happens, again, because, well, they all compete for resources, for land, whereas in the city, you more or less compete for opinions and for, well, these more vague things, you know, because, well, land doesn't matter in the city, roughly speaking. I mean, in principle sense. I mean, economically, of course, you might say, well, you can sell a land in downtown for a higher price, etc. But this is not what I'm talking about. Again, why is downtown land is higher in value? Because more people visit downtown. So in cities terms, that's why it has more value, because there's more people and more exposure to this dialogue, you know, this complicated dance of interpretations. Yeah, something like that. So, and a good analogy to what a city is might be its like central square, something like that, which is like, again, if we think about the ancient times, like the ancient Greece and ancient Rome, It was like agora in ancient Greece or forum of ancient Rome. It's exactly that. It's the very idea of a city in a nutshell. It's a I'm sorry, damn corona. So the agora or forum is, again, an idea of a city in a nutshell. And what it is, it's a place where people meet. People with different opinions, people with different financial possibilities, people with different values, interpretations, possibly religions, etc., etc. So it's this place where all the people meet and talk about all that and try to establish some middle ground and try to establish ways to exist together, to develop together, to build this place into something better than it is right now, etc., etc. And I believe also that this idea of agora or forum is actually much more ancient than even those Greek or Roman policies. Policies, not policies. And it goes back to the times of, tribal organization of human societies, to basically the campfire. So the tribal campfire is the same thing as this Roman forum or the Greek agora or our modern, like, central, places in our cities where the whole idea is to assemble differences rather than make them fight each other, basically. So this is the idea of a city, and this is the idea of a tribal campfire where people share their opinions, people tell stories to each other. Again, see my video Nature of Knowledge, where I say that basically any knowledge is just a bunch of stories. So people tell their stories and try to assemble the society in a better way than it is currently, and they discuss how would they proceed, blah, blah, blah. So hopefully you get the idea, all right? And so I believe that this approach, this hegemony of art, might be this very thing. Like it might integrate all those horizontal networks. It might be more, how would you say, more contemporary to the idea of a city, since right now most of us live in the cities rather than in these territorial areas like rural areas, etc. So a human being or an individual human being in these conditions might become the ultimate creator, right? So yeah, and that would be the hegemony of art. That's why I'm talking about art and creativity, is because, well, you create your own values and you share them with the others, and you compare them to others people's values, and it becomes something else, and the whole thing kind of grows around it and evolves, and all kinds of things happen. So yeah, I'm kind of sorry that I'm being too abstract here, but I hope you intuitively can feel what I'm talking about, at least, right? So, but you might ask, well, why are you talking about me, meaning about the networks of power, these networks of interpretations, even though I've talked about these things in my previous videos? Well, you might ask, why? Isn't that something political? But yeah, I mean, isn't that not related to art itself? Because, well, supposedly, according to, elementary school understanding of art is just something completely irrelevant, just some bunch of strokes on a canvas or something. But I would say that no, absolutely not. Art is exactly that. It's these networks of power. It's networks of interpretation. It's political networks to a large degree, because what is an art of a certain artist, let's say? Well, it's a network of their aesthetic influences, and that's all, basically. It's their interpretation of the world through their lenses, so to speak. And where do they acquire these lenses? Well, firstly, from their personal experience of the world, which is different from other people's experience of the world, so their values are different. And secondly, from their own aesthetic influences, meaning the socio-aesthetic influences. So the influences of other artists on this particular artist, right? Without S, artist. And it creates this unique network, which is an artist, this particular one. Damn. And so this particular artist later produces their own creations which influence other people, all the people, roughly speaking, at least all the people who are aware that this artist exists. But even then, like, let's say we have three people, this artist, the guy who is aware of their work, and the third person who is not aware of their work. But if the second person knows third person and they have some contact, then this artist might influence the third person through the second person, right? So again, it's a network, and it's like infinitely long, roughly speaking. It encompasses the whole society that way or another. So that's what I'm talking about. It's these networks of power, networks of influence, networks of aesthetic impact, etc., etc. So yeah. So that's what I call hegemony of art. This stage where I guess we have again this game of interpretations, like this horizontal clash of different interpretations, but clash not in an aggressive sense, not in a violent sense, but in a very actually civilized sense. Again, if you think about the city and how it is organized, it's very civilized. It's very, again, civilized comes from the word civitas, right? Civitas, which means city, right? So yeah, civilization is also coming from the same word. All right, so hopefully you get the idea. Like in the modern day and age, but okay, I'll come back to that a little bit later. Right now, I wish to make another comment that perhaps some of you had in their head already, is that my three stages, this hegemony of religion versus hegemony of science versus hegemony of art, kind of resembles, but in a weird way, this Danish philosophers, Søren Oby Kierkegaard, I completely butchered that, I know, three stages of the ascension of an individuum, so to speak, where he says that, well, it's like one of the first existentialists, like pre-existing existentialists, like, you know, again, Kierkegaard, this basically the only known Danish philosopher, right? He's kind of pre-existing existentialist, another tautology, almost like the Stooges were the pre-existing punks, you know, kind of that kind of guy. So the three stages of the development of an individual he talked about, of course, with his own system of values, were aesthetic, ethical, and religious. So it's almost the reverse of what I'm talking about, right? And he talked about these in his books, like Either or, from 1843, and Stages on Life's Way from 1845. Although, to be honest, I much more enjoyed his other book, which is Seducer's Diary, 1843. It's a really good book, like I recommend it. Okay, so anyway, yeah, so his views are almost exactly reversed to mine. So he thinks that the religious stage is the most advanced, so to speak. But again, first of all, he talks about the individual, I'm talking about the society, and he talks about, roughly speaking, himself. And I'm also talking about myself, basically. So anyway, I'm okay with our difference. Again, I'm kind of playing my own card here. So I'm saying, okay, there's this Kierkegaard who has an almost opposite opinion to mine, and I'm completely okay with that. Like, I'm ready to live with him in the same city, even have him as my neighbor. I don't want to fight him. I wish to, you know, again, kind of compete with him, with my system of values against his, and like have a dialogue, etc. So this is again the idea of a city. City is the place of meeting of people with different opinions. This is the, like, in a nutshell what a city is, like the ideal city, so to speak. Right? Okay. So I'm in certain sense, I'm proud that I have different system of values than him, because it makes me more individual, more me than him, you know. So I have my own values and not his, even though my values were also taken from all these different sources. But anyway, I have my own network and he has his own network, etc. And speaking about that, or rather returning to the beginning of this video where I talked about the synonymity, or how would you say it, of what I call art and what I call creativity. Again, perhaps one of the other factors that may make this worldview more likely to emerge is the frequent argument that is made against robotization. Like, people say, well, what, just purely socio-economically speaking, what advantages do people have against robots, let's say? And like, one of the most frequent arguments is that people are creative, whereas robots are not. So yeah, this might be another possibility to reinforce this idea. Although I wouldn't deconstruct this question of what are the advantages of people versus robots. Again, I've had a video about the artificial intelligence, this rise of the machines video, etc. And Onion of Aliens, I've also talked about the origins of intellect and its properties, etc. Intelligence, I mean. I wouldn't be stopping here, but potentially it's another argument in favor of this sort of worldview. Okay. So in this, again, worldview, world might be perceived like, almost like, to give you an analogy, as a huge store where shoes are being sold or something. So you just travel it and pick whatever you like, whatever shoes fit and whatever shoes you think look good. And those are most likely would be different shoes than anyone else picks, right? Or, given all the possibilities that we have today, you can make your own shoes for yourself. Then they would be completely unique. Then that would be like the ultimate manifestation of what Nietzsche calls like creation of new values, like reevaluation of values, etc. And maybe other people would like to buy your shoes, like the ones that you produced. Then you've had your network of followers, etc., etc. You would have some political, aesthetical, economical, social power, etc., etc. So again, it's all about power, basically. But it's not the power that usually people understand by this word, which is like, you know, raw power. Again, speaking about the Stooges. Raw power has a healing hand. Raw power can destroy a man. You know, something like that. Okay, I'm kind of, yeah, that was a bad take. Okay. So, to get to the conclusions, I would say that, again, in those two first stages, which is the hegemony of religion and the hegemony of science, as I've called them, we've had hierarchies, right? And now, what now emerges, this hypothetical hegemony of art, as I call it, we have this network organization. So vertical two ones versus horizontal one. Although, I mean, science also has certain properties of network, so it's already kind of slightly crumbling. But art is completely network oriented. This sort of art, and I don't mean like what we currently understand as the like proper art in a proper sense of the word, where you have like a dozen of world famous artists and like gazillions of artists who nobody knows. I'm talking about this particular philosophical understanding of art, which is creation, like manifestation of your values, of your perspective, etc., etc. That's what I'm talking about. So it is network oriented. It is horizontal in some sense, right? So how did we get to the hegemony of science? Well, we had the separation of church and state, right? So how would we get to the hegemony of art stage? I would claim, and this is a very strong claim that I wish to make, is that what we need is the separation of science and state. That would be really cool. So what we would have then is that a lot of this bad science would just die out, like naturally. And I hope you would agree that today there is more bad science than good science. So statistically speaking, if you cut the state's support of science, there would be much more bad science destroyed than good science. So yeah, no problem at all. And again, this whole new stage, this hegemony of art stage, as I call it, is a completely different approach to like perceiving the world than science was. Science as we know it, like mainstream science, etc., academic science. So it would be something completely different. It is already, I would claim, something completely different. It's just not quite recognized yet. And I hope this video would kind of bring us closer to this realization that you can have competing theories. It's completely all right. You can live in a city and have like 5 professors with 5 different opinions on a single matter, etc., etc. So yeah. So if we have the separation of science and state, then we possibly can enter completely, like transition into this new epoch of true hegemony of art. Okay. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.